Hello everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Katrin Youssef, the marketing coordinator at Schlafender Hase, and I will be your moderator for today. Schlafender Hase is the company behind TVT, the content verification software trusted by health authorities and leading companies in industries where errors are not an option. TVT catches every change, discrepancy, or deviation, no matter what the format, layout, or language, so it can deliver documentation that's accurate and compliant. Today, I'm joined by Marc Chaillou, Head of Sales Europe and Global Strategic Projects at Schlafender Hase. Marc has been working in the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry since 2011, specializing in pre-press labeling, specifically how processes and technologies can reduce costs and delays, increase inefficiencies, and reinforce patient and consumer safety. We're also joined by Peter Müller, Director Americas, who has been working for over 25 years and helped Fortune 500 companies across pharma and medical device and consumer good industries. Peter has deep experience partnering with international clients to define their organizational goals and drive productivity gains, process improvements, and cost savings. Between the two of them, that's decades of first-hand experience with watching labeling and proofreading evolve, from their processes to the technology to the regulations. There is really no one better positioned to walk us through where this industry has been and where it's headed in our session 15 years of labeling, what's changed and what's next. So today, let's get started with Peter Miller.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we're focusing on kind of some of the major changes in the past 15 years that impact labeling. As Catherine mentioned, Marc has about 15 years of experience helping clients with labeling challenges, and I myself have 16 years. So combined, we're 31, 32 years of labeling experience here today. We're going to focus on the labeling impacts and have a bit of back and forth discussion between Marc and myself to make this kind of webinar format a little bit more interactive. And if we could have the first slide, please, Marc.
There we go. So hello, everyone. Nice to be there live. I'll let you start on that one, Peter.
Excellent. So the first major change we've seen over the past 15 years is serialization and security. So track and trace is another term for it. We see UDI and 2D matrix codes are becoming quite common, required now. They're a unique machine readable 2D code that's on individual packaging, and they're not just batch level coding. So on a lot of products we see a batch or a lot that has a specific barcode. These are specific to that package. That prompted a redesign of the secondary packaging with much tighter process controls around that. We also saw investments in variable data, tracking to a database, and RA, regulatory affairs, is typically involved in those artwork updates, so it's something you need to consider. They came or stemmed from laws such as the U.S. Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which mandates tracking products from the manufacturer to the actual pharmacy. As part of this as well and related is anti-counterfeiting measures. So advanced security technologies such as holographic seals, microprinting, tamper-evident closures. This is all standard in a lot of originator medicines now. And again, that also prompted a redesign of sometimes the primary, but definitely the secondary packaging. And so if you're checking labeling, then an early check in the process of barcodes saves time and cost. Obviously, the earlier you find an error and correct that error, the less expensive it is. So if you wait until the very end when the packaging is being printed and you're scanning, the codes either at incoming QC or QA inspection time, it's a little bit late to find that. So you want to find a technology that's using the GS1 or ISO standards for decoding, grading, and comparing barcodes so that you can see that your barcodes are correct. Also, some of the anti-counterfeiting measures can also be reviewed with tools such as microprinting. Very, very small text. You can't, read it without some sort of enhancement. So using a tool other than a magnifying glass is a good practice to adopt. Marc, on to you, unless you have some comments.
What we saw as well is, and I think this example of serialization becomes even more important today to look into the future or the present, which has to do with e-labeling. I think we'll touch on this as well. Specifically because this is an initiative which initially almost started on production when packs have to be manufactured and printed. But of course, the whole of supply chain was impacted. So IT was impacted, packaging was impacted, regulatory was impacted, artwork department was impacted. And this is a little bit a similar scenario today what we're seeing with e-labeling. There are multiple departments are impacted. So it's not a single dependency. It's really the whole chain is impacted, and certainly regulatory affairs have a very, very important role to play. And we'll see as well that with regards to EPI e-labeling, the role of regulatory is even more important because the barcode now becomes, I keep saying the barcode, in that case, the 2D code becomes the labeling. So this is the patient information leaflet. This is what gives access to it electronically. So that is definitely something that is becoming more and more relevant for regulatory teams.
Yeah.
If we look at how we as an industry help ensure compliance and help ensure patients are able to read the content on the product, so the labeling. Some initiatives that have been implemented include the plain language labeling, so ensuring that, of course, the content is easy to read for patients. So this came from both redesigning the look and feel of leaflets, ensuring as well that readability testing is being made, making sure the terms used are as simple as possible, so they are understood by the majority of patients. Spacing between the paragraphs, of course, ensuring that the text has a high contrast. Most leaflets are printed with a black text. We see some in dark blue sometimes, but this is certainly less common. And yes, the spacing and the font size is also regulated in most markets. So, for example, in Europe, leaflets have to be a 9-point font size, minimum font size. And checking the font size sometimes is not so easy, specifically on very large leaflets where there's a constraint of space. Also some folding boxes. So how do you know the right fonts? Are you using the right font size? It is a regulatory requirement, so it has to be checked. And certainly checking this with a naked eye is maybe not the easiest way. So there are tools there that can help verify that you're compliant as well into the size of the text. Also, as you know, there are a lot of labeling updates triggered by standardizing terminology. And this is, of course, always very important, and this needs to be verified every single time. What we see as well is there's an ongoing standardization of the medical terms. So, for example, the use of MEDRA is very, very important. And why is this important? Not just for today, but also for tomorrow. So everybody keeps asking about how to use AI for different things. One thing that helps AI become more efficient, more accurate, is to simplify the content. So having files that are structured, that are standardized, makes the use of AI or makes AI be more efficient, more accurate. So this is also a good thing that the industry keeps going in that direction. And the use of standardized terms also helps AI to provide more accurate results. So not only it is recommended and requested by the industry to help patients, but it also is helpful for us in the industry to make a better use of AI and get better results when using it. And there's also the proposed updates for standardized patient medical information that will make it again easier for patients. So this is really, I think, an ongoing process. And again, when we look at EPI, this will also be particularly relevant with the possibility of providing with patients with access to specific sections that are relevant to them. So, for example, me as a patient, I may not need to read information about what should happen if I take the medication while I may be pregnant. So, for example, that may not be relevant for me. I can also check based on my weight, based on my age. So these are possibilities that are now being given with the EPI. Again, always to make it easier for the patients.
And Marc, you mentioned tools a couple times. How are people checking all this content if they don't have tools in place?
Well, if you don't have tools, it's usually a long, manual, complex process. It's part of the job, but certainly using technology makes life easier, makes it more accurate, makes it faster, and significantly less prone to errors. So this is always the recommendation. But we see more and more tools are being used in the industry to make these checks significantly easier.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're going to discuss, labeling and content, labeling content and formatting changes, both for the FDA and for globally. So we had the, well, first of all, when we're speaking about content, we're speaking about, the text, the spelling, medical dictionary, as Marc was referring to previously, about standardization of terms. In some markets, we have Braille. We often have pictures or graphics, and we also have barcodes. So, format changes present a challenge. We're going from, say, a Word document to a PDF, a Word document to an XML to a PDF. Now also with e-labeling coming, we have HTML and MHTML. So there's quite a few format changes and reuse of that content across the organization. And we're just focusing on labeling content, but if you see that cascades into other areas of the business too. So, marketing, ad promo, is also a function that uses this labeling content, extensively. So that's the kind of the major changes we've seen are, the physician labeling rule, so PLR, which required a structured or more structured format for drug labeling. And it mandated, among other things, it mandated a highlight section and a table of contents for the prescribing info. We also had PMI, so the patient medication information. It's a proposed new standard or a new standardized one-page PI. And it, is designed to replace some of the confusing or perhaps very detailed pharmacy leaflets. And then, for in North America or in the US, rather, we have, SPL, so structured product labeling, where it's a standardized electronic format for submission. And you see this being adopted around the world. So Health Canada adopted the structured product monograph, which is very closely based on SPL. We have, various health authorities around the world that are now either accepting SPL or, for example, in the European Union, we have QRD templates. Certain jurisdictions are exploring the use of FHIR. or actually deploying the use of FHIR. So this, we put structured product labeling as an example, but there's the FDA version, but there's numerous examples from around the world where this is becoming more and more prevalent. And hopefully in the future we see some standardization between the regulatory authorities, where perhaps they can all agree on FHIR and use that one submission format for everywhere around the world.
One question with regards to that was maybe something from slightly earlier, where we were talking about making things easier for patients. Is there any recommendation, Peter, that that should be taken, whether we are using, especially if we are publishing content online for patients? Any recommendation to make it easier to read and make sure all patients are able to access that information?
Yeah, so I believe it's in a later slide when we're talking about e-labeling, but there are various regulations around the world that speak directly to this. So in the US, we have something called Section 508. And there's something in Europe which is very, very similar, called the European Accessibility Act. Health Canada doesn't have a standard, but each of the provinces in Canada actually have their own standard too. But basically, what Section 508 mandates is that if you're going to publish information to a government website, so for example, DailyMed, your files that you're publishing need to be accessible. And accessibility means that if I'm, visually impaired, or and I want to use, my PDF reader to increase the font size, or if I want to use a program to read the prescribing information out loud to myself, using, Adobe Read Out Loud, or Daisy Reader is a popular application, you need to make sure that the order of the text in those documents reads correctly. So it's something that a graphic designer can actually set in the parameters of their files, is how the reading order flows through the document. So you can check this manually by highlighting text and holding your control key down and pressing the sideways arrow, and you'll see actually how the text flows. But it's another compliance item that not too many people are aware of, and that should be checked. And so this is a legislative requirement while you're publishing information to a government website. However, most of the clients that I work with also want to be, good corporate citizens and make this, content accessible, even if they post it on their own website, which isn't subject to regulation. But it's a good point about, how some of these things stretch across not only the labeling content and how do you structure that, but also e-labeling and patient readability, etc. So good point that goes all the way across, Mark.
Okay, so it's basically something, making sure the text is in the right order, not just the order we see, but the technical order of the file, or the website, or how software would read the content to make sure it's going to read it in the same order we visually see.
Correct. Yes. Your brain can figure out that, this sentence ends and I go to the next one. A computer that's looking at it has to be given cues of where does it start reading, where does it finish a sentence, and after it finishes reading from left to right, the first sentence, does it jump to the next sentence, or is there two columns of text and it has to jump over to the next column of text? You and I can figure that out, just by visually looking at it. But a computer that would be reading software out loud or text out loud to a user can't do that. It needs to be given cues in the file of where to start and stop reading.
Okay. Thanks. We're going to talk a little bit more about e-labeling as promised. So we're seeing more and more countries are encouraging the use of e-labeling. So this is a mandatory in certain markets already. What we're seeing as well is that obviously there's this idea to link in the code, in the QR code on the packaging, on the folding box of the product, to link to the patient information leaflet that is online. So we used to be, years ago, we used to send paper across to get everything approved by the health authority. Now we're sending Word files, and then we're taking these Word files. The graphic teams are now creating PDF artworks, and of course, regulatory has to check that the PDF artworks are correct. But in addition, now we are creating formats, as you mentioned, Peter, in XML. So the SPL is an XML format. With the EPI, there's the use also of the FIRE format, which is another type of SPL, another type of XML format. There's also HTML, so the content on the website. So we are multiplying the types of formats into which the content, at least for the transition phase, we have all of those formats. And one of the challenges the industry is facing is, how do you ensure the content is always correct on all of those formats, irrespectively? So you used to have a Word file, now you have a PDF artwork. Is the content the same? Or you have the Word file, now you transfer it as a FIRE format. How do you ensure the content is correct? This is certainly something that can be done visually, but it takes a very long time and there's a high risk of error. Of course, there are tools to do that. This is why we're here as a company, to make sure that in the transition phase, you are able to transfer all of your data from Word to FIRE, and making sure everything goes well, all the transfer is done correctly, there are no conversion issues. One big question is, once the e-labeling is created, who's going to host the label? Is it going to be hosted by the health authority, or is it going to be hosted by the manufacturer, the marketing authorization holder? What we see for now in the industry is there's this both approach. A good example is in the GCC region, where there's the Nashatec portal. So that's the authority who is the authorities who are hosting the labeling information and providing support. But for now, we hear that while they are encouraging to use that portal, nothing is mandatory. So it is still left for now to the marketing authorization holder to decide if they want to use their own portal or the health authorities portal. This, of course, creates some complexity because it would be easier to have only a single one, but this is currently, I think, to boost adoption and encourage the transition. I think this is the reason why the industry is going into this dual approach.
Yeah, and that's one example, Marc. But you also have, Rotliest in Germany. You have Daily Med in the U.S. So there's various different regulatory regimes, let's say, around the world, where some you have to submit, some you don't have to submit. Others you can do both. So it's evolving.
It's evolving. We're going to talk a little bit about the QR code. So barcodes, QR codes, historically are often, they're always verified at the printing stage to make sure they have printed correctly and that they are readable. Also verifying that it is linking to the right data. However, with EPI, the challenge is that the QR code is actually the label. And as you said, Peter, if you check only that the QR code scans at the end of the process, you're taking a risk because this is significantly more expensive to correct than if it is checked earlier in the process. And we're seeing more and more regulatory teams being tasked to verify that the QR code is accurate. Peter, can you maybe explain a little bit how it should be checked by regulatory and how we should probably not be checked, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions, because we all have a smartphone that can verify barcodes. Also, we can use a scanner. What are the limitations of verifying with a smartphone or with a scanner? Not at printing stage, but earlier on at regulatory stage, and why does it make sense to have regulatory teams verifying the data there?
Yeah, good question, because and it basically comes down to the standards. There are standards on how to create different types of QR codes, two-dimensional codes, as well as one-dimensional codes, so your traditional barcodes. And those standards are governed by either ISO or GS1, depending on the type of code. And those are the most popular ones, I would say, in the life sciences in general. There are other codes that are used in, say, FMCG or for warehousing and things like that. Yeah, exactly. So those for each specific barcode, there's different what they call grading criteria. So there's different parameters surrounding those codes that need to be complied with, so that when a code is actually scanned, the code can be read and can display or take you to a website that displays that data. So if you're using a code scanner on your phone, yes, it's decoding it, but it's not, or hopefully it's decoding it. It's not giving you the compliance information. Is this compliant with the standards surrounding that specific barcode? So I think it's very important for labeling now, because that's your method of accessing the labeling. It's also very important for traditional linear barcodes. You want to make sure that if it's an OTC product up on the shelf, that it's going to scan correctly at the cash, and you can pay for it. But it becomes doubly important with e-labeling now.
So when you scan with your phone or with a scanner, it's basically confirming that it worked with that device.
Yes.
And you can read the data, so you know if it's the actual correct barcode, but you're not verifying that you will always scan with all devices, because you're not confirming against those ISO grading criteria and those GS1 grading criteria. This is what the issue is of only using the phone or scanner, and that's why it should be checked also. Are you verifying that the grading criteria, according to grading criteria, these will always scan with any device? So this is why it should be done earlier in the process, as well as at the end of the process. And lastly, another challenge with using the phone is or a scanner. Again, because this is a patient-relevant information, you need to have a full validation of the device. So you can of course validate your scanner or your smartphone, but you also need traceability. You also need to have the full audit trail. And then you don't have that audit trail on the phone, so that's another challenge. Okay, so we looked at e-labeling, and one thing we get asked about all the time, and I don't think any presentation nowadays concludes without talking about the most interesting topic of all.
Yes, exactly. So AI, one of the topics that is very, very popular at the moment. So some newer information that you may have not seen yet or been aware of. So EU is proposing a AI Act where they're going to be classifying high-risk AI systems. So AI can be used in regulatory and labeling, and if it is, AI is going to be much more closely looked at or scrutinized. It kind of reinforces, and what they're trying to do is reinforce that labeling always needs to remain accountable, auditable and traceable. And that's one of the challenges we have currently with generative AI is when because the labeling is the safety or is a safety component of the product, it's highly recommended that you validate these processes, these systems, right? And validation of AI, especially generative AI, is difficult, if not impossible, because the results need to be reliable and repeatable, traceable, auditable, right? Kind of anecdotal point here, the FDA has stated that 97 to 98% accuracy is good because it replicates a human is typically 97% accurate. But as we know, the average patient information leaflet is about 2,600 words. So if you apply that 98% accuracy standard to that 2,600 words, that means that 52 of those words are potentially wrong. So for labeling being the safety component, having a 98% accuracy level is not good enough. You have to have 100%, because even if you get one word wrong, it either results in a recall or, in the worst case scenario, compromises the patient's health. So it's something we're seeing increasingly being, used for accelerating certain processes, like drafting, translation, consistency checking, that kind of thing across different labeling content, different markets. However, you really need to be careful and always ensure that there's a human in the loop, and human oversight of these processes, as you're looking to develop them. Make sure that the human is making the decisions or is in the loop, approving these things.
Okay, so if we put it differently, should you proofread with AI?
I wouldn't yet. There are certain things around proofreading that can be enhanced with AI, but the core verification of the content, it needs to be 100% accurate. And a tool like ours, TVT, is 100% accurate, and it's validatable. And really, I think that's the key measure, key test, is that if you can validate the software to have the same repeated result every time, then you can trust it, right? And you can audit it, and you can trace back things. With AI, it's especially generative AI, it's not there yet.
Yeah, and I mean, having this human in the loop means you would need to have a human verifying that the output is correct. So you basically have to proof it anyway.
Yes, correct.
Okay, we're going to look now at a quick demonstration of TVT, the text verification tool, and explain how this can support also in the we'll make it maybe more tangible how this can support also with regards to not only labeling but as well e-labeling. Okay, so I put it here. There we go. So this is the TVT, just logging in. And what we're seeing here, so for those who may know it, this is a browser-based version. So here I have access to previous projects I may have done before, I may have compared. So I'm going to create a new project and I want to upload the files. But what I like to do is just, of course, I can upload them from here, but I like to just simply drag and drop the files into the application. This is my favorite method. So this is a typical pharmaceutical leaflet. So on the left, we have the Word file. On the right, we have the PDF artwork. And this is the thing. If you are working with API, you're creating a file, then you can just load the file, the XML file here on the right-hand side, and making sure that the content is the same as the content you have on the Word file. Or you can compare it to the SPL, for example. You can also compare your website to make sure the content you have published online is still the same as the PDF, the Word file, as you wish. So the files here have been loaded. I'm going to, you see the text is orange. It means it is all selectable, and I will be able to compare it. What I will do is I will now exclude the text that I do not want to compare. So I have this exclusion area here. So this will not get compared, but everything else will be compared, including the barcodes are being read. And I will show you exactly what we mean by the grading criteria when we look at the barcodes. So that's it. The software has made the analysis and identified that there are some differences in the files. They are listed here. So what is grayed out is not relevant. It's not showing up in that document. There is no reading order issue. So what you mentioned earlier, Peter, making sure that the visual order is the same as the technical order, or the technical is the same as the visual order. But we'll be able to review the other items that are showing up in red. And now I will just go in my list. So we have the first item here. DVI has been added to the document on the right-hand side. And this is now for me to decide, is this acceptable, or is that a mistake, is that an error? In that case, I will say this is an acceptable difference. So I click here on this accept, and then I go to the next one. I'm going to zoom in as well because it's a little bit small. And I can see here again, we have the dosage is different, or the concentration is different. So I need to decide. I would say this is a mistake. It's a mistake on the copy side. The copy is the document on the right. The one on the left, we call it the original. That's how we call it in the application in TVT. So I'm just going to say, okay, that's a mistake. It should be corrected. And automatically I have a comment. 0.0025% should be 0.025% as in original. I can, of course, if I want, double click, go back and edit my comment. This is the information that will be then given to the person in charge of updating the document. So in a typical artwork review, the regulatory affairs person will be making that comment and then sending it to the graphic designer. So I can continue here to my list, and then I see I have again another error. I can decide as well to mark it and continue like this in my list until I'm basically exhausted all the items in the list and everything has been reviewed correctly. Here it's pretty nice. You can see in colors in red, so you see exactly what the difference is. Schlafender. So this is a very common way of misspelling our company name. So I'll mark here in copy. And then the last one is actually, this has been removed from here, and it's actually an acceptable differences. So you can review here text deviations. We have warnings as well, which are changes that do not alter the meaning. So for example, here we have capital to non-capitalized letter. The E is non-capitalized. It is nonetheless a mistake, so we'll still decide to mark it. And we have it here again. This was capitalized, it's no longer capitalized. I will also mark that one as an error. Other things I can do, I have hyphenations. So what we see is a lot of pharmaceutical companies recommend to simply not have hyphens at all in the documents because there are certain rules that, of course, to where you and how you can hyphenate words. So it's probably recommended to not hyphenate at all if you can. But as there are probably a lot of space constraints on some documents, sometimes you have no choice but to add hyphens, and then you need to make sure the words are hyphenated correctly. So surface is hyphenated correctly. Then we go to edema, which is also hyphenated correctly. I can accept. And eyelashes is, for example, not hyphenated correctly. So I decide to mark it. I continue in my list. I have critical words. I simply repeated words. So here, this one is showing up because I have DVI here and then DVI here. So it's twice. This is in that case acceptable. The next one, however, it says do not drive, and that's a mistake. This should not have been repeated. So I will decide to mark this as an error. I can also let's have a look at what we call the style. So these are, again, part of regulation. Is the text in bold? Is it underlined? Is it in italic? Do we have a specific font size that is required? We can also verify those things. So here we're analyzing the formatting, and then we see we have 3 transitions been marked. And what I will be doing here is simply review. So I know this one is in copy is regular, but was bold in original. And if I click, I can see, oh yes, that word is now regular. It was bold. Maybe that's acceptable. So I can untick the box, and maybe I go to the next one, and maybe this one is not acceptable. This should have remained in bold. So I leave it selected, and it will show in my list of comments. Another example we have very often in Europe. The European Medicine Agency's website, the underline here is removed, and that's usually an acceptable difference. When I'm done, I can simply click on the little tick mark here to say, yes, I have completed the style check. One thing I like to do here on that example is have a quick look at the barcodes. So we have here some pharma codes. So I can see the data. I can see this one is code 1234. If it's read in one direction, this one is a bi-directional barcode, so it can be read in the other direction, and then the code is 1835, so you can verify it's actual accurate data. And here's what we have as a grading. So you see it's a pass. That means it's technically according to the ISO and GS1 standards. So depending on the barcode, as Peter said, there are different types of standards being used. But here it's passing successfully all of those standards. And it means unless something goes wrong on the printer, as long as it's printed, the printing machine works correctly, this will scan on any sort of device. If one of the grading criteria was not met, then it would show as a fail. So for example, grading criteria we have for this type of barcode would be let's see which one I can. Well, bar width gain, I think, is maybe the easiest one to explain. So how big is the barcode? If it's too small, for example, then it will be very hard to scan. So this one is fine. We can accept, and we can do this for the other ones as well in that particular example. And then once we're done, we then need to generate a report to send to the graphic designer. So I can go from here, generate a PDF for my graphic team, so they know exactly what they need to correct. And we have the file here. Here we go. So this is just a normal PDF. And here we have the comment, maybe a bit small on screen, but here we go, just some time to get the resolution. So 0.0025 should be 0.025 as in original, etc., etc. So this we can send to the graphic designer, and he knows exactly what he needs to correct. And for audit trail purposes, we also need to ensure we are generating the full audit trail. So when we get inspected, or we get an audit, we can have a proof that yes, these files was verified, and we have all the information about the user. In that case, that was me. And all the differences that have been identified in the documents, they've all been marked or accepted, and none remain means the whole comparison was completed. Okay.
And then also, Marc just reminded me, referring to different compliance standards, right? So we've got 21 CFR Part 11 in the US and EMA Annex 11. So not only do you need to verify this, but these things have to be signed off and traceable per regulations.
Absolutely. We can have a look at really quick at another example, because sometimes not only do we want to check the leaflets, we want to make sure the folding boxes also are correct. And in this example, we'll also see that we'll be able to run a graphics comparison of the document. So in that case, we're using the TVT artwork module. So I'll just go ahead and compare. And what I will do is I will just look at it from a graphics perspective. I will not look at it from a text comparison, but just an image comparison. So you see I have here images, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on. So I have the two files are selected. Just make it a little bit bigger. And I want the software to tell me, well, do I have any changes in here? And if so, where are they? Just click here on the comparison, and it's now running a graphics comparison between the two files and identifying pixel by pixel where are the differences. And here we can see in green that some differences have been identified. We can also decide to close it and look at it from the list, same as what we do with the text. We have a representation here, so we can see that a dot period was removed. Maybe we can decide to zoom into the file to have a look at this very closely. And yes, we can see the period was removed. So here we're just running a graphics comparison on that one. And then we can, same as before, we can decide to mark it as an error. I can also, of course, edit the comment and mark it. Again, we have another one that was removed, so we can mark it. Okay. And same thing, then we can generate the report. We have also some other types of barcodes on that particular example. Here we have a QR code, and we can see, for example, that the grading criteria are a little bit different because it's a different type of barcode. And here everything is black, it means everything is fine. The quiet zone is also fine. So the quiet zone is how much space you have around the barcode. If your barcode is too close to text, then it may fail as per grading criteria, which means scanners may struggle to scan. So, but here everything is fine. Okay. Do we have questions in the chat? So anybody who has questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer a few questions.
All right, actually, we do have some questions. The first question we have is from Marina. When would you advise IVD manufacturers to start redesigning their labels to comply with the new EU regulation 2025-40?
So good question. I think whenever there's kind of packaging redesigning, labeling changes that happened, you kind of have to do an impact analysis. So you have to look at when are you required to comply, and then how many SKUs do I have to change? How many labeling components is that information posted online? Is it used in any marketing ad promo type? Probably not in the EU, but if any of those changes impact other components that are around it, you kind of have to start from the from the end and work your way backwards, because it'll vary. How many changes, how extensive the changes are, yeah. So I would say that's probably your best advice, is to start with an impact analysis and work it back from the beginning to see how much time you actually need to give yourself. Knowing how long it takes a redesign, how many people will be involved, how many SKUs are impacted, things like that. Marc, would you add anything?
No, I think that's yeah. No, nothing to add.
Okay.
All right, the next question. Do Mexico and Brazil use e-labeling?
Not yet. So they haven't fully authorized or approved e-labeling. So both Anvisa and Cofepris are looking into it, but they're not. They've not mandated it nor approved it yet. So exclusively e-labeling. A manufacturer is able to have a printed leaflet and providing e-leaflet, but not like the EU is doing, where it's e-labeling or e-leaflet only.
Okay. Let's see another one. Does TVT use AI? Do you want to answer that one, Peter? Or
So TVT doesn't, because we're 100% accurate, just based on the deterministic algorithms we've put into the software and how the software is developed. So it's 100% accurate and validatable as is now. So using AI for the core of what TVT does would probably not be helpful. Now, we are exploring using AI to enhance certain things around the core of TVT. So maybe making the user experience better, maybe providing some guidance on certain things. But for the core, TVT is all deterministic, and therefore can be validated.
so there is a use case to use AI, but not for the comparison itself. However, to help the user to make it easier, make it more efficient, and add additional functionality, there are use cases for AI, and not only are we exploring, but we're working on it.
Yeah.
Can TVT do translations of other languages? It's a question from Keith. So no, the software doesn't do translations. The software is used to compare content irrespectively of the language. That means while you cannot compare Arabic to English in TVT, you can compare Arabic files to Arabic files, Russian files to Russian files, Hebrew to Hebrew, etc., etc. There's a question from Nathan. Can TVT be used to identify edits that should have been made in a new version of a document? For instance, if a new model of a device is made, a device to a device Pro, would it be able to identify a missed update remaining instance of device that should be changed to device Pro? So okay, so to identify, that's a good question. So no, the software will only identify the changes that have been made, but not the changes that should have been made, if that makes sense. Unless the files that was provided has information about the change that should be made. So for example, if the file you load has a comment already to say, please implement that change, and that change was not implemented, then yes, because it reads the file and it knows there's an annotation, and then you're able to see that the change was not made. But it will not review your document to ensure that changes have been made if there is no instruction in the file to make the change.
Yeah.
I hope I was clear.
Seen,
I'm not sure.
yeah, no, I think that was very clear, Marc. The one.
Oh, Peter froze.
Yeah, he froze. He might come back here in a minute.
Okay. Then I'll answer the next question, also from Nathan. What file types can TVT handle? Can it specifically handle compare images, PNG, or labeling software such as BTW in Bartender? So for now, TVT supports most file types: Word, Excel, web pages. We are Adobe Illustrator, XML formats, multiple XML formats, and we are implementing PNG and TIFF as new formats to support. So that will be in the next release. There is another question.
Oh, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, you froze, Peter.
I actually got out of the meeting and I rejoined.
Okay.
My answer was too long.
Yes, there's another question from Erin. What was the graphics version of TVT called again? So it's called TVT artwork. You have TVT artwork. You also have TVT barcode to read, grade, and compare barcodes. There's another question, this time from an anonymous attendee. Can you compare XML files for API? Yes, you can. I think we have some more questions. Let's see.
I see one, I think, fairly recently from Nathan. What types of files can TVT handle?
We answered that one.
Oh, you did? Okay, good.
Okay, so if you have more questions or you like to reach out to us, please do so. You can reach out to Peter or myself, and we'll be happy to answer any question we may not have answered during the call today.
Excellent. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and we'll give you 3 minutes of your day back.